1, 2, 3, 4. Welcome to Crazy Chester. Welcome to Crazy Chester. Crazy Chester's Radio Hour. Welcome to Crazy Chester. Welcome to Crazy Chester. Crazy Chester's Radio Hour. Yeah, Crazy Chester's Radio Hour. Crazy Chester's Radio Hour.
Welcome to the Crazy Chester Radio Hour. My name is Andreas Werner. I'm a record producer, songwriter, and owner of Crazy Chester Records. The theme song you just heard is performed by Wet Willie's, Jimmy Hall, and Funky Chester. The Crazy Chester Radio Hour is a weekly music talk podcast featuring an eclectic group of guests with musical hearts, minds, and souls. And many of the episodes will dive deep into the history of music mecca Muscle Shoals. We taped this episode during the W.C. Handy Music Festival at the Nut House Recording Studio in Sheffield, Alabama, where many of this area's most recent music has been recorded, including the Grammy-winning bluegrass album, the Muscle Shoals recordings by the Steel Drivers, and albums and tracks by Alabama Shakes, St. Paul and the Broken Bones, Jason Isbell, and James LeBlanc. Holger Petersen is a record producer, radio broadcaster, and record label owner. He started Stony Plain Records in 1975 and has been on the air on Canadian radio for over 40 years. He's collaborated with many of the greatest musicians of roots music and has released many of those artists' releases on his label. He's also released 2 books called Talking Music and Talking Music 2 on Insomniac Press. And I met Holger earlier this year at Midem in France, and we immediately discovered that we have a lot of common interests in the love for music, love for record collecting, and it is my pleasure to have him on my podcast today. Holger, how are you doing today?
I'm doing very well, and it's absolutely my pleasure, Andreas. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Knowing that we have that much in common and knowing how much you know about music, I knew you were an instant person I thought of when I was casting my podcast, because I knew we wouldn't run out of stuff to talk about. But maybe let's just go back and kind of start at the beginning. How did you discover your love for music initially?
Well, I guess like a lot of people approximately my age, it would be listening to Top 40 radio and discovering British invasion music. And you know, it hit me at a time when people all of a sudden, you know, you're looking for something to identify with. And for me, that was that rebellious rock and roll created by the Beatles and the Stones and the British invasion bands. And recognizing that so much of this was R&B and blues influenced, and that kind of started me in that direction, collecting records. There used to be a place that serviced 45s in Edmonton, Alberta, where I'm from, and the ones that were into the jukeboxes in northern Alberta and central Alberta. There were two places that serviced those jukeboxes, and they would have the ones that weren't popular enough to be in the jukebox, or the ones that were kind of worn and this and that. They would have them in these bins, 5 for $1. So on Saturday afternoons, I'd be flipping through bins and starting to collect records and read the credits on records. You know, songwriting credits. You know, it would say recorded in England or produced by. You'd see these various things, and then eventually you'd realize that certain record labels did certain kinds of music. So that was where my interest really developed, was collecting these records and listening to them, of course, listening to a lot of B-sides.
Yeah, and how did this affection for music and its details translate into you wanting to turn this into your profession?
I wanted to be a drummer, and I would have drumsticks in my hand a lot. I remember just recently this kind of came back to me. When I was in high school, I had these little binders. You're always, sitting in class, and I'd be drawing drums, and had a desire to play drums. And I started taking drum lessons and bought some cheap drums, and then eventually played with a few different bands, basement bands, just covering material, learning songs, and learning about crafting songs and arrangements, that sort of thing.
Yeah, and then you started producing records.
Yes.
And can you tell me a little bit how you got into that, and what kind of artists were part of those early productions?
Sure. Well, I have to credit, there's a radio network in Alberta, CKUA, that's a public broadcasting network. That's the oldest public broadcaster in Canada. And I started doing radio shows, and specifically a blues show on that station. And that gave me the opportunity to interview artists as they came through, and I was also writing reviews and that sort of thing. And then in 1972, after finding out a little bit about, working in radio stations, being able to record a little bit in radio stations, some of my friends, I booked a studio, and this local band called Hot Cottage, I booked them to come in, and we were going to do a couple of songs, which hopefully was going to turn out to be a 45. Well, that same time period, April of 1972, Willie Dixon's Chicago Blues All-Stars came through Edmonton, and the band included Walter Horton on harmonica, Big Walter Shaky Horton, one of the true legends of Chicago Blues harmonica, who was previously with Muddy Waters and even the Memphis Jug Bands. He had a long, long history. They came through, and I was backstage. I did interviews with Willie Dixon, and I met Walter. He was very reclusive, but Willie was very generous. And he said, well, we're going to be in town for a few days. Why don't you come and hang out at the hotel? We can do some more interviews if you like. And I said, great. So the next day I was there hanging out in Willie's room. And Walter knocked on the door and came and visited. And he had gone to the liquor store. He got a bottle of Teacher's Scotch. And so I said, do you mind if I do an interview with you? And he said, sure. So he was staying down the hall. And I did an interview with him, and I said, I've got studio time booked tomorrow. I know you're not traveling tomorrow. Would you be interested in doing a session? And he said, sure. So that was incredible that such a famous harmonica player would be in town at the same time as I'm recording a blues band. And that's how that unfolded. That was the first single. And we actually got London Records in Canada to release it, and that was enough to inspire me to bring Walter Horton back in the fall of 1972, and we did a full album with him and the band Hot Cottage then.
Yeah, and you told me that for some of your early productions you would actually go out to California to get a mix. Can you tell us a little bit about that, and some of the places you worked at, and some of the people and artists you met there?
Sure. Well, after doing Walter Horton, that was done in a 4-track studio. The owner of the studio said, this is really good stuff. You should really mix it somewhere else, and I know some people at Wally Hyder's in San Francisco. You could go down and mix it, and that was advice that I followed. So I ended up on a couple of projects going down to Wally Hyder's, and they assigned Jim Gaines to produce, to mix the records that I was working on, and we would do that in the morning. So Jim was the new guy. He had just arrived from Memphis and was working at Wally Hyder's in San Francisco, and they rolled out this old 4-track, which they wouldn't use there except for mixing a project like mine. And set it up, and so we work in the morning when nobody else was working. We got this amazing rate, and I was staying across the street at this flea bag of a hotel called Lafayette. They called it the Laugh-A-Lot. And I got to know some of the people in the studio who, took pity on this guy from northern Canada and said, we have a lounge here with a pool table and pinball machines and coffee. Just come and hang out here. You know, you don't have to stay at the hotel all day. And that was really, really wonderful because hanging out in that lounge, I ended up being invited into control rooms and studios where Herbie Hancock was recording his album called Septant. That was really great. David Briggs, who was Neil Young's producer, was working on a project. He invited me in, and I was a fly on the wall. So that was really wonderful for me to have that kind of experience, to be just sitting there watching how people made records.
Yeah. So at that time you started producing your first album. You were a drummer, or at that point too, and you already had your own radio show. What made you add record label owner to your already busy schedule?
Yeah, after the 1972 Walter Horton record, I brought Roosevelt Sykes to Alberta and organized some live shows for him and recorded an album. Johnny Shines, who I was especially fond of, came from Alabama. And we recorded an album, and then the next year I brought him back, and we did another album. And I was producing a few other people, but every time I produced a record, I would then have to try and find a way to get it released. And back then, Transatlantic Records in Europe released a couple. And I had a couple of labels in New York that were interested in my roots music. But still, the process was a long one, and I had my own money invested in it, such as it was. So my Canadian label that I was licensing to was London Records. And then I just thought, well, I'm doing so much of this myself. I'm producing it, I'm doing the artwork and that sort of thing, delivering all this. So I asked London, I said, well, what if I started my own label? Would you distribute it? And they said, sure. So Stony Plain Records was formed in the fall of 1975 by myself and Alvin Johns, who was a chartered accountant, and we're still partners. And the first record came out in 1976, and that was an artist by the name of Paul Han, a local Edmonton artist at the time. And that was the very first Stony Plain record, and now there's over 400.
Yeah, and you work with a long list of amazing artists, and I would love for you to just kind of comment on a few of those and maybe single out how you got in touch with that artist initially, and then maybe also some memorable moment attached to that collaboration. And I would love to start with Doug Somm.
Yeah.
How did that collaboration come about?
Yeah. Well, after Stony Plain was in business for about 4, 5, 6 years, I had only released maybe a dozen records, and they were generally records I had been involved in producing myself. And I thought, well, if I'm going to be taken seriously as a label, I'm going to have to put more releases out on Stony Plain. So then I started licensing, and at the time, we started licensing the Sugar Hill record label, and Ricky Skaggs and Tony Rice, and some really cool things. Excuse me. And then that led to Rounder Records. We started licensing releases for Canada on Rounder Records, and then that led to High Tone Records and working with individual labels, picking up various things. And at Midem one year, Sonnet Records, a Swedish company, were recording and releasing the Sir Douglas Quintet. And I was a big fan, and so we picked up the Canadian rights. Rounder picked up the U.S. rights. And then after the next record, Rounder passed on it, so we got the North American rights for the Sir Douglas Quintet, the next couple of records. And I hadn't met Doug Somm until after about the second record came out, and we started talking on the phone, and we had these great conversations, and Doug liked to just get in his car and drive. So, eventually he said, well, I think I'm going to come up to Canada and visit you. And I said, great, he said, can we maybe meet on the West Coast? And I said, yeah, I'm going to the Vancouver Folk Festival. Would you be interested in going there? And we can meet there. So he drove up with his partner at the time, and the two of them checked into a hotel, and it was I got them passes to the Folk Festival, and we ended up hanging out. Then we ended up going on a fishing trip in northern BC and just becoming friends. And then he started coming to Edmonton. I booked the Edmonton Folk Festival for several years, and I started booking Doug Somm, and I think he came for about 5 or 6 years in a row. And it was Doug with a whole bunch of people that he was already friends with too, Rick Danko and Garth Hudson and Danny O'Keefe. But anyway, I got to know Doug really well, and he liked Canada. So because he was kind of a free spirit, he would drive up to Edmonton and just stay. Instead of, going back after the festival, he'd stay at my place quite a bit, and we put together this band basically for Doug, and it had Amos Garrett on guitar and Gene Taylor on piano, and we called it the Amos Garrett, Doug Somm, Gene Taylor Band. We did one album in 1988. I think it came out in 89 and was quite successful in Canada. We licensed it around the world. And as a result of that record, we won a Juno Award in Canada for that release, and we got offers to tour in Japan. And so I ended up kind of being the de facto manager and traveling with Doug Somm at all these Canadian festivals, and then going to Japan, doing a live record in Japan with that same band. So Doug was a dear, dear friend, and one of the most talented people I ever had a chance to meet.
Yeah, and you mentioned Amos Garrett, who is a great, great guitar player, and he also played a lot of sessions around Woodstock. How did you get to work with him?
Amos was Canadian and used to play in Toronto with the Great Speckled Bird. His first kind of claim to fame was as a member of the Great Speckled Bird, which was Ian and Sylvia. I had heard Amos's music and heard Midnight at the Oasis and followed Amos's career. I thought the Paul Butterfield Better Days bands with Amos on guitar on 2 albums were some of the best blues albums I had ever heard. So I was a fan of Amos. And Amos was also a fly fisherman and a duck hunter. So he used to come out to Alberta a lot. He would always be duck hunting in the fall and fly fishing whenever he could, in the spring. I got to know Amos, and he had left Maria Muldaur's band, living in the Bay Area. And then he decided to relocate to Canada and to Alberta for the fly fishing and the duck hunting. And we became friends, and I became his manager and booking agent and then record producer. We ended up doing quite a few records together. But Amos is one of the world's unique guitar players. He has a way of playing that a lot of people would think would be a pedal steel guitar. He does 3-string bends, and his solo on Midnight at the Oasis is just one of the great guitar solos, I think, of all time. And that's really who Amos is as a guitar player. That's his style. And I think he's influenced people like Mark Knopfler and a few other people.
Absolutely. I know that Colin Linden quotes him as one of his absolute favorite guitar players. I think David Wilcox too, and a few other people. But one of the great albums Amos Garrett played on was the Bobby Charles solo album, his first solo album he did for Bearsville Records. And a little later on, you got to release some Bobby Charles albums on your label. How did you meet him?
I first met Bobby Charles at Midem again in France. To the surprise of anybody that ever knew him, he actually got on a plane and went to Europe to meet people in the music industry. Very unusual for Bobby, who was reclusive and didn't really like the music industry very much. But he was there and was walking around Midem, and I met him. And I couldn't believe this was Bobby Charles. And so we ended up just being friends that way. We had meals together, we hung out together, and he was such a wonderful, charming, amazing person, you know. It was a really good friendship. And he was actually pitching a record that was called Wish You Were Here Right Now, which had Neil Young on it, and Willie Nelson, and all kinds of wonderful people, Fats Domino, and it's an exceptional record. And after all his, you know, work at Midem, he didn't get anybody to release it, except I was really interested, and so we put it out in North America, I think for the world actually. And that started a friendship, and I went down to Louisiana and spent time with him a couple of times, was in the studio with him in New Orleans. And for a man who wrote, you know, See You Later, Alligator, and The Jealous Kind, and I Don't Know Why I Love You, But I Do, so many amazing songs, you know, you would think that this would be such a classic songwriter that, you know, is even still alive. Well, back then, he was still a, you know, relatively young man, and he had spent a lot of time in Woodstock. Our mutual friendship with Amos Garrett, I think, really helped open the door as well. So I have to credit Amos with that. But knowing Bobby Charles was just one of the great highlights of my life, I think.
Yeah, and with Amos Garrett, we mentioned Maria Mulder before too, and you've had a long working relationship with her. Can you tell us a little bit about her and some of the projects you guys did together?
Sure. Yeah, Maria Mulder, I think, is kind of like the grandmother of Americana music. Those records that she made in the mid-'70s, Waitress at a Donut Shop, and working with so eclectic artists. I mean, there would be one record where, you know, one song where Benny Carter's big band would be on there, and the next one would have Doc Watson on it. Another one would have James Booker on it, and of course Amos was in and out of all those things. And Maria had some sizable hits. So I was a huge fan, just as a music lover. I was a huge fan. I loved those records. And then she started coming through on tour, and I would interview her and meet her and just get to know her. And then eventually, working with Amos, occasionally I'd have the opportunity to put Amos and Maria together again on a concert in Canada, or we did TV shows in Germany and Ona Filter and things like that, which I kind of pulled together. So I got to know Maria. And then the first record we did together was called Jazzabelle. And then we did a series of records where Maria would still do kind of big budget projects for labels. And then as a fallback label on projects she really wanted to do, she would come to Stony Plain. And we've done a whole series of those, you know, jug band records with, you know, people like David Grisman, Dan Hicks as special guests. Richland Woman Blues, which was nominated for a Grammy. I think we've actually had 3 Grammy nominations with releases that we've done with Maria. And Bonnie Raitt has been gracious to guest on several of those records. Richland Woman Blues was inspired because Maria and I were at at that time called the W.C. Handy Festival in Memphis. And we would go down south and visit Memphis Minnie's grave. And we did this several years in a row. And Maria just said, I want to record a record, you know, with this spirit of Memphis Minnie. And that was Richland Woman Blues, which was quite a celebrated record, and I think one of Maria's best. So again, a wonderful friendship, just based on total respect for what she had done, and then having the opportunity to work with her on I think some really great music, you know, being part of that.
Yeah, absolutely. We have a mutual friend, and that is Colin Linton, who obviously is a great guitar player, songwriter, producer, catalyst, and lover of great music, especially blues. Besides being one of the most busiest and hardworking men in show business I know, And I had the pleasure of having him down here in Muscle Shoals a few months ago to do a recreation of The Last Waltz, and got to work with him and play with him, which was a treat. But your relationship with Colin goes way back too. And can you tell us a little bit how that came about? And you're still collaborating too, so maybe kind of chronicle your journey a little bit.
Sure, a pleasure to talk about Colin Linden and all of these wonderful people. But I used to go to the Winnipeg Folk Festival in the mid-'70s. That was the kind of after Mariposa in Canada, Winnipeg was the one that really came along, and they used to have some wonderful people there. And Sam Chapman was one from legendary Mississippi Delta, recordings, so Sam Chapman was there, and I was doing an interview with Sam Chapman, which consisted really of him kind of playing and talking and playing and talking. And this teenager, maybe, 14 or 15, was sitting next to Sam Chapman with his guitar, kind of taking a lesson at the same time. And so I was there with my tape recorder, and that was Colin Linden sitting next to Sam Chapman. And so it's nice to have actually a record of the very first time that you met somebody, especially when they're so young, playing with a blues legend, and that was Colin. He was a student of great blues. He was a friend of Howlin' Wolf's when he was 11 years old. His mom used to take him to go see Howlin' Wolf and repeatedly, and there's a great photo of Colin and Howlin' Wolf together.
That he, I believe, still carries around with him in his wallet, too.
He does. He carries that in his wallet. So that led to a friendship with Colin that just went on. And I think it was 1982, his very first studio album was released on Stony Plain Records. So we became, we were friends then, and I was trying to help him get gigs across Canada. Then just last year, we ended up working together again on his latest record. And in between, we remained good friends, and Colin is just one of the nicest people, as you said. So for me to have that long-term friendship with Colin has been really rewarding, and to see his success, it's wonderful to see somebody develop from being a young teenager who loves music to traveling the world and being the music director on the Nashville TV show, and being on stage with Bob Dylan and Emmylou Harris, and having success with Blackie and the Rodeo Kings, playing sessions with Greg Allman, and being T-Bone Burnett's understudy, if you would.
Playing in Bob Dylan's band is another one.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And another thing we have in common, Colin and I and all of us, and you being Canadian, my favorite band of all time was The Band, obviously, which is mostly Canadian, and I hope everybody knows that too. And you mentioned Rick Danko a little bit earlier, but can you tell me a little bit kind of how the band kind of fits in here, and what the band kind of meant to you?
Sure. Well, as you well know, Colin Linden's favorite all-time band is The Band, and the favorite two records of all time would be the first two records by The Band. I love those records as well, and in Canada, maybe especially in Canada, we're very aware of Ronnie Hawkins and the Hawks. And, to my estimation, Ronnie Hawkins is the most influential blues and roots music artist in Canadian history, because he worked with the band and the various versions of the Hawks that came later that included so many amazing musicians.
Including Richard Bell, who was a dear friend of Colin's too.
That's right, yeah. So knowing that and following that, and those records coming out at a time when my tastes were really developing as discovering what great records were, what great songwriters were, and of course the uniqueness of the band's subtlety. It was all, they worked as a band. There was nobody that was really doing wild guitar solos, or it was just such an ensemble. But They were amazing, and when I was the artistic director of the Edmonton Folk Festival, pretty much top of my list was, let's see who we can get. And Rick Danko came twice to the festival, and the second time he came, he brought Garth Hudson, and I had the band that backed them up was Colin Linden and his band. So that was a really great way to cement their relationship as well, because Colin Linden went on to write material for the band, and get to know them and befriend them, perform with them.
Yeah, absolutely. And we kind of started this off with Doc Sam, and one of his most advocate supporters was Jerry Wexler. And
Yes.
Jerry Wexler is also one of my number one role models as a music entrepreneur and producer, among other things. And he became an important part of your story too. Can you tell us a little bit how that came about?
Yeah. Again, with thank you, Doug Somm, because when Doug would be staying at my place, he would get people on the phone, and he'd say, "Oh, say hello to Doug Clifford, from Creedence Clearwater," and I would go, "Oh, okay," and he'd give me the phone, and he'd say hello to Jerry Wexler, and I talked to Jerry and met him through Doug Somm on the phone, several times, and then. I guess when Maria did the Richland Woman Blues record, we sent a copy to Jerry Wexler, and he really championed that record. So then he became a big fan of Stony Plain as well, between knowing that I worked with Doug Somm and Maria Muldaur. And he did the liner notes for one of our anniversary albums. I mean, you couldn't imagine how I felt having, Jerry Wexler, my hero, contributing several hundred words of liner notes, raving about Stony Plain Records and the work that we had done. It was just couldn't get better than that. So that was a wonderful situation, and Jerry was just really supportive. I talked to him every once in a while. He'd send me all kinds of things in the mail and keep in touch.
Yes, and we're here in Muscle Shoals. We all know Jerry Wexler was very influential and very important to get this area off the ground musically, and became a lifelong fan of this area and friend to many musicians down here. And this is your first time, or your first trip down to Muscle Shoals, although for a long time you've admired the music. And would you mind kind of telling me a little bit what Muscle Shoals music, or the concept of this area, kind of was for you before you ever came here?
Well, I guess as a blues fan and somebody who spent a fair amount of time, studying, reading, listening. First of all, the W.C. Handy connection was major, and to be here right now during the W.C. Handy Festival is a fantastic time to visit the Shoals area, and of course, so much of my favorite music and musicians and songwriters and singers were, if you watch the film Muscle Shoals, you're just overwhelmed by all the great music that has come out of here. And even as a record collector, about these certain things, but then when it all adds up, and you see pictures of the area and interviews with the creators, it's unbelievable, the stories that have come from this area, the songs that have come from this area. So it's, to me, to be here this first weekend, to have my first experience in this area is pretty overwhelming. And to be able to go to the studios, to go to the Alabama Hall of Fame, to yesterday run into Funky Donnie Fritz, I think maybe 5 times in different locations, just walking around. I mean, this is such a walking legend. And then to have barbecue with him, and to see him again today, and to meet Jimmy Johnson and David Hood repeatedly, and to see David Hood playing on stage with the Decoys at a club. It just doesn't get any better. And then on top of that, not only is this history still alive with these inventors of pioneers of this incredible soul music and Southern rock music, then you start to realize what's really going on nowadays and how much great music there is in the clubs, and the songwriting community that's in this area is just unbelievable. Of course, people know about the Jason Isbells and the drive-by truckers and Alabama Shakes and the great success stories. Well, there's just so much of it here, and I would highly recommend people come at any time and come and hang out at Muscle Shoals. And if I'm talking to musicians and songwriters, I'm going to say, don't go to Nashville. Maybe go to Muscle Shoals and spend a little bit of time here first, and then decide, because it's a great, soulful, friendly, funky environment. Very friendly.
Yeah, and we're sure glad to have you down here and be able to show you all of that, because that's played a huge part in what I'm doing. That that transition from being a fan to actually coming down here and getting accepted and getting to collaborate with all these people. It is to be able to, and as you can tell, it's not very hard, because they are so warm and welcoming and make you feel, special and treat their visitors and their guests really well. And they have pretty decent food too, I must add, which
and I can't stress and thank you enough, Andreas, for inviting me down, for opening so many doors, and to see the wonderful respect that you have in the community from everybody, from these wonderful legends. Everybody credits you with pulling so much together, the community together, and having people working on different projects together. So I can't thank you enough for inviting me down, for taking me around and letting me kind of follow you around.
Well, you're very welcome, and I knew all along that you and Muscle Shoals is a good fit, so I was never worried about that. And I would just like to let everybody know once again that Holger has a couple books out, Talking Music and Talking Music 2. One thing I want to mention, since he talked about Muscle Shoals, that especially in the second book, he's interviewing Dan Penn and Spooner Oldham, but across the two books, there's other people like Sam Phillips, who has a strong connection to this area, Mavis Staples, who recorded some of the signature songs of the Muscle Shoals songbook. And I can warmly recommend your books to anybody, and they're available everywhere. And it's been real enjoyable for me to be able to talk to you. We've done this a lot off microphone, and that's been a new experience to me too. Also, I'm sure I can learn a lot from you, having all this history in interviewing people in radio and so forth. And what's important to me with this project is that all the people we talked about and all the great musicians, especially the ones that are a little bit more behind the scenes, that they get to tell their story, and people get to learn about their work and their catalog. So anyway, thank you so much for spending your time with me today. And we're going to go out and listen to some great Muscle Shoals music now.
We are, Andreas, and thank you. And I just want to add a couple of things. I don't think I've ever run into anybody who has as much detailed knowledge and specifics about any kind of music. Nobody like yourself. The knowledge that you have and the respect and love for the music from this region is just incredible. So thank you for sharing that. And I was thinking, you mentioned Sam Phillips. When I interviewed Sam Phillips at his home in Memphis, he made a point of talking about Florence and coming from Florence and talking about how important this area was. And so he was one of the first people that kind of hit me to that too.
All right. Well, thank you so much, and we'll talk again.
Thank you.
This was the 4th episode of the Crazy Chester Radio Hour. Special thanks to Jimmy Nutt and the Nut House Recording Studio for hosting us. Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. See you next week.